All right. So now we come to the third question that I want us to talk about a little bit and consider. And that question is, how will Indigenous leaders be developed? We've talked about how they will lead and where we're going to find them. But how will those leaders be developed? How will we develop ourselves? And how will we develop those around us? And the answer to that question simply is that they will be developed by learning about the laws of leadership, developing an understanding, a proper and a correct understanding, we might say, about what leadership truly is, and a full understanding of what leadership really is. We know that when we study the Scriptures, we're told in the Scriptures to take into consideration the whole counsel of God's Word. Well, when it comes to leadership, we need to make sure that we're understanding the full spectrum of what leadership is and not just one aspect of it. So we need to help them learn about leadership, and we ourselves need to learn about leadership if we're going to develop as leaders. But then we need to begin to learn to practice those laws of leadership that we've been talking about. That's just one way of talking about leadership that John has come up with. But we need to learn to practice those laws of leadership, and thereby we become better leaders. We actually change and become the kind of person that we need to be in order to be a better leader. And that is possible. It is possible. We don't have to be destined, shall we say, to remain as we are. If we stay that way, we'll probably die. If you're not growing, you're dying, the saying has been. And so we need to become better leaders, and we do that by learning how to practice these laws. And John has identified that as the law of process. The law of process. We develop ourselves as leaders by engaging in the process of growth and development as leaders. You know, I come from a family of potters in Santa Clara, Pueblo. I grew up on the reservation there in Santa Clara, on my reservation. And my grandmother, who is my dad's mom, was Margaret Tafoya. And through the years, she became a very well-known potter. She has pieces in the Smithsonian Institute. She has been recognized with a number of awards, including one of them, the Folk Artist of the Year by the National Endowment of the Arts in 1984. And she has passed on that talent and artistic ability to most of her 9 children. How has she done that? She's done that by implementing this law of process. She's done that by passing on her knowledge of the fundamentals of making pottery, her knowledge of the nuances of making pottery, and then by engaging those children of hers in learning and practicing those fundamentals and those nuances of making pottery. You may not be aware of this, but traditional Santa Clara pottery, and other pueblos make the same kind of pottery, is not made with a wheel. It's made just totally by hand without the help of a wheel, like ceramics are made. And yet it comes out so perfectly. And so all of the aspects of making pottery, she has helped them to understand and grasp. And her children have then passed on that same information and that same skill to many of their children in the same way, to some of their children. And leadership, like any other art, is developed in the same kind of way. We shouldn't be surprised. But you might say, we don't practice what we know to do. It's an art, and there are many facets to it, and it takes time to develop. You might remember a story from the Old Testament, a true story, of course, about Moses from the Old Testament, right? One of the greatest leaders that God ever used. And one thing we need to remember is we think about Moses maybe at the end of his life standing on a big mountain and facing the wind and about to part the Red Sea, maybe as they crossed the Red Sea, or after he'd received the Ten Commandments. And but sometimes we might forget that Moses did not become a leader in a day. Sometimes we forget about the journeys that people have. And along the way, he learned some valuable lessons, I think, as a leader. And he learned to lead. For one thing, he experienced early on God's grace, and I think we all need God's grace in our life as leaders because we mess up and we fail. But and God's hand preserves us, but in his life, he experienced God's grace preserving his life as an infant. And I wonder how many times later on in his life he reflected back on the fact that he should have died because there was a death sentence issued by the Egyptian people against male babies, and yet God saw fit to preserve his life. So he experienced God's grace, and God did great things through him. Every time God has in mind to accomplish something, Henry Blackaby says, a baby is born. Every time God has in mind to accomplish something, a baby is born. Maybe God has in mind for you to accomplish something. That's why you're here. I hope and pray that you will find out what he wants you to do and that you'll embrace what he has for you to accomplish in your life. So early on, he experienced God's grace. He went on, Moses did, to learn not to take rash actions in his life. That was another leadership lesson he learned when he killed the Egyptian in Exodus chapter 2 and tried to hide his body in the sand. He learned that lesson, I think, because later on in his life, he would step up in action again to protect his future wife and her sisters. And he took the right action in the right kind of way at that time. He learned that lesson. He learned to listen for God. As God appeared to him and approached him in the burning bush of Exodus 3, I think it was not only the bush that got his attention, but Moses began learning at that point to listen for God's voice as he sought to understand who this God was that was speaking to him. Later on in that same chapter, he learned to receive God's plans for what God wanted to do in and through him, and how we need to understand and listen and receive God's plans for us. And sometimes it's a challenge for us to discern what those are, but with practice, we can begin to do that. And then he learned to trust and obey. And that actually took a couple of chapters of miracles and excuses in his life. And God's anger being displayed. And just throughout those chapters of chapter 3 and 4, God had to prove to Moses that he was going to be with him. And as Moses made excuses, God had to convince Moses. And as Moses continued to resist, God had to get a little angry with him. And then God just demonstrated his grace even more by giving him Aaron to speak for him. And then he finally started to lead in chapter 4. It's sort of funny because, we think about what Moses did with leading the people out of bondage, and he certainly had a tremendous journey as he did that. But leading up to that, he had some things to learn, and then as he began to actually begin to lead the people, you might say, he still had lessons to learn. all the way through that journey until the end of that journey. You might remember his father-in-law giving him advice, his father-in-law Jethro, and giving him advice about how he needed to not carry the load himself and how we need to learn that lesson as well. I'll talk about that here in a second. And Moses' impatience still showed up as he got angry with the people over their sin, I believe it was, and he broke the stone tablets. And God had to actually discipline him for his anger. So Moses had a lot to learn, didn't he, as a leader? And it's a process. And he developed and he grew as a leader, and he learned lessons along the way. The law of process means that leaders at all levels must take the time, as we said earlier, to learn about leadership. We may have a great start, but still have lots to learn. We might be a pastor, or we might be a current leader in a prominent kind of leadership position, but we need to learn about it. But there's others around us that need to learn about it too. The children's worker needs to learn about it. The janitor needs to learn about it. It helps all of us to know what leadership really is. But even more than that, as I said earlier, after we've got a good grasp of what leadership is, we need to engage in practicing good leadership. We've heard the old saying, practice makes perfect. Well, we can go one better, as it's been said, that perfect practice makes perfect. The more we practice doing leadership right, the better. Practice has to be part of that learning process. Reflecting on our mistakes, learning from our victories, learning to do it right. Just like a potter who takes a lifetime to practice her craft, it takes a lifetime to develop ourselves as leaders. Knowing and using our strengths and compensating for our weaknesses and our mistakes along the way. But then let's not forget, maybe the most important task, or certainly a critical task of leadership, is the task of developing leaders around us. Because we cannot achieve what God wants through our lives by ourselves. There are no lone rangers when it comes to successful leadership. There are no, one person doesn't make a successful basketball team or a football team. We have to have a team of people with us. We need to develop leaders around us, and I wonder if there are those around you that you might consider developing as leaders. Those around you that would welcome the opportunity, that are maybe looking for help in their own journey to develop as leaders. Maybe they're not even aware of the fact they need to, and you need to make them aware of that fact. That's what I'm doing. It's trying to help people become aware of the fact that they need to grow in this area. So there might be people around you that you can help and invite to come alongside. My hope and desire is that you're not feeling overwhelmed about this idea of leadership. As we think about the fact that it takes a long time, maybe a lifetime, of course, to develop as a leader. There's a lot involved in leadership, in developing yourself as a leader. I hope you're not overwhelmed, and that you won't just say, well, that's impossible. I hope that you'll catch the vision for the fact that God does want you to grow and develop as a leader. Only He knows exactly what role He has in mind for you to fill within His kingdom's work, shall we say. He knows what that role is. And I think He just simply wants all of us to be about the business of growing. So I hope that you'll do that. I hope that you'll just get started in that process. And I'm going to give you some information, some opportunities to do that in our next session, as well as this one as well, here in just a second.